Hey everybody, this week on the Inkwell, we're back in familiar territory as we review a turquoise ink. And not just any turquoise ink, this week we're going to be taking a look at Visconti Turquoise. Now, recently, my ink purchases have been more cart-filling or budget ink as far as the decision-making goes, especially since I was trying to work my way through the Pelikan 4001 series. But the glass of wine I was drinking, or was it scotch that night? Anyways, whatever I was drinking that night convinced me that paying $14 for a rather interesting looking bottle, especially of a turquoise ink, was going to be well worth it. So let's go ahead and take a look at this lovely ink from Visconti. Now, before we get to the ink, we do have to cut through a few Visconti-isms that you're going to notice about this particular ink. The first being the choice of interesting plastic packaging, or an ink display case, which is an interesting touch. I think it would have worked a lot better if they hadn't used that particular shade of blue, especially since the bottle shape itself really does command your attention, and even if this had come in a plain cardboard box, it still would have been good aesthetically as is. And I mean, there are a few trade-offs here. In this case, this is a plastic bottle, not a glass bottle, but it does the job of getting the ink to you without spilling it everywhere, cracking, or just otherwise causing a very bad time. Speaking of the ink, let's go ahead and take a look. One of the first things we're going to notice here is that this really isn't going to be a sheener like some of the other turquoise inks that we've seen here on the channel, but you are going to get a nice dynamic range between the light blue and the dark blue, as well as seeing some shading coming through on more of the lighter areas as well as you get closer to the edges of the ink line itself. And I actually do find that to be a nice change of pace from all the other turquoises that we've seen. And the dry time is also a rather interesting feature of this ink. At the 20-second mark, we're still waiting for it to dry with a broad nib, and from the looks of it, we would probably be sitting here waiting for a 40-second, 50-second, or even a full minute dry time out of the broad nib. Now, if you put it in a finer or medium nib, you're completely dry by 10 seconds, and that's actually a really decent result. Now, back to the broad nib here for a second. You can see the color variance that we're getting from Visconti Turquoise as it hits the paper. We're getting some good dynamic range between the lights and the darks, almost like the ink blot, but not quite as severe on the lighter scale. This is starting out more in the lighter mids and going to the darker tones. And out of a pen, I notice we're actually getting more sheen than we did when we did the ink drop itself. It's still not a lot of sheen, but it is present. I will say though, my favorite property of this ink is definitely the shading. You can see here, I'm writing like medium slow at this point, I've come to accept that, but I'm still getting a good amount of shading. I think if you're a fast writer, you're gonna see more of the mid blues coming out, but if you write medium to medium slow, you're going to have a nice dynamic range in your writing, and I just think it adds a little bit more character on the paper. But let's go ahead and hit that water test and bring it home to the recap. Alright, so that result really kind of speaks for itself. This ink has no water resistance, so what it has in color, it definitely doesn't follow up here, which is kind of a shame. There are other turquoise inks that, honestly, have much better water performance and have just as pleasing of a color. So, bringing everything back around, what we have here with Visconti Turquoise is an ink that had so much going for it, and yet kind of let it all slip away there at the end. We've got a good color profile, good shading, not as much sheen as some of the other turquoise inks, but hey, sheen is not everything. But what really disappointed me was the lack of water resistance. I can even forgive the weird packaging that comes with this ink, but that water resistance is a real deal breaker for me, so this ink probably isn't a keeper. I've got plenty of other turquoise inks that are much more workplace friendly, and honestly, have the exact same dynamic range, if not more. But hey, if you like Visconti and you don't need water resistance for your daily writing, then yeah, at $14, you get quite a bit of ink, you get an interesting looking bottle, and it's not a bad value as far as that goes. It's just not my cup of tea. Or maybe I should say, not my cup of Visconti, as it were. Anyways, that's going to do it for this video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow the channel on Twitter and Instagram, social links down below, and consider supporting the channel over on Patreon. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next week.